Thank you very, very much for having me. This is a really impressive collection of speakers, so I'm looking forward to learning from you all as well as sharing my limited knowledge on this. So I will be speaking really as a historian. And, I do think that the history is relevant. I think that what I would like to do in the few minutes that I have is just kind of quickly run through what I think are some of the more significant sort of historical guideposts along the way of what kind of got us to this point. Because I think that when one looks at the history, one cannot help but come away feeling that this entire nuclear issue, this sort of crisis that has sucked up so much energy in the conversation around US-Iran relations over the last 20 plus years, is actually rather avoidable and unnecessary. It's very much my opinion that this is an issue that could be eminently resolved rather relatively easily in an atmosphere that is positive and constructive between the two countries. And it is an issue that is almost impossible to resolve in an atmosphere that is hostile and insincere and antagonistic between the two countries. To some extent, that's just logical. When you're at, when you are full of enmity with someone, trying to resolve an enormously technical, complicated issue like a nuclear program is just it's going to be rife with challenges and issues. And conversely, I think that when we look at this historically, we realize that Iran's actual nuclear file is not that serious. There are many other countries that are in similar kinds of have similar kinds of question marks over their IAEA inspection records, where we don't have the same level of drama that we have around the Iranian nuclear issue. So just very quickly looking at this historically, and I beg your forgiveness for having to go back so far. I mean, I just finished a book, or just come out with a book that covers almost 300 years of US-Iran history. I'm not going to go back that far, but as I suspect many of you are already aware, but for the purposes of our kind of audience and anyone else kind of listening to this, important to remember that Iran's nuclear program actually dates back to the 1950s, to 1958, and is an outgrowth of the very close cooperation with the United States and under initially President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program that wanted to ensure that nuclear technology was used for peaceful as well as peaceful purposes rather than destructive purposes that it had already been used for. That is what gave rise to the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that basic kind of concept of atoms for peace. It's important to remember that it was the United States that sold Iran its first nuclear technology, including helped it build the Bushehr reactor in the 1950s and 60s. Or I should say, I can see Barbara shaking her head, yes, providing at least some of the fuel for the Bushehr nuclear reactor. You're absolutely right, thank you for catching me on that. Yes, it is true. In any case, it's by the late 1960s and early 1970s, Tehran, it's much too early, the Tehran research reactor, I think that's what you want to see. By the 1970s, thank you, Barbara, for catching me. I knew there was something what am I getting? By the 1970s, the United States is cooperating much more closely with Iran in developing its nuclear industry. And the questions that are being asked today were simply not being asked, or they were being asked very quietly in the 1970s by both the Nixon and the Ford administrations and even the Carter administration. There was a relative amount of unanimity among the American scientific community, energy community, and policymaking community in Washington that a nuclear program would be a desirable thing for Iran. That as a developing country with a large amount of petroleum at its disposal, that it simply doesn't make, and this is still true, doesn't make a lot of sense to build very expensive, complicated refineries for what is always going to be a very limited amount of domestic demand for refined gasoline. So it makes more sense for a country like Iran, it always has and it still does, to sell its oil on the international market and use that, use those funds to develop a genuinely sustainable energy industry. Nuclear is not the only way to do that, but it is one very significant way to do that. Certainly an option that the Shah of Iran was exploring. and it was one that the United States tended to strongly support as a kind of logical approach for Iran's kind of energy needs, meeting Iran's energy needs. The other thing that's relevant when we talk about history is Iran's entry into the NPT in the first place. And this is actually an important point. I would just remind everyone, the NPT has three basic principles, right? Disarmament, non-proliferation, and cooperation. And these are actually, I agree with Lord Haney. I mean, the NPT remains to this day a really, in some ways, inspiring international attempt to, reduce the threat of nuclear annihilation. But it's important to, I think, occasionally revisit its basic principles. And remember that the point was, well, we had, 5 nuclear armed states, Soviet Union, United States, China, Great Britain, and France. The desire was not to add additional nuclear armed states. And so non-proliferation is, of course, a critical part of the NPT. But part of that bargain, it's important to remember, is that a whole bunch of other countries had to agree to not develop nuclear weapons. The key that I always go back to on this was that for countries in the developing world, this was a challenging prospect. It was not a very appealing prospect. And the key is this, as I always try to tell people when I'm kind of explaining the NPT, it makes sense what the NPT, I mean, so you've got the non-proliferation aspect of it, and you've got the disarmament aspect of it, which is also important to remember has never really fully happened. The US and the Soviet Union, of course, have made some progress towards disarmament, but they still have 6,000 nuclear weapons each, more than enough to destroy the world many times over. And the cooperation part of it, which is almost become a bit of a mockery, right? I mean, the idea that, if you're going to ask other countries not to develop nuclear weapons, then you have to be able to help them with their peaceful nuclear technology, which was the original point of Atoms for Peace. The key to remember is that for the 5 nuclear armed states, you can see the appeal of the NPT because it retains their preeminent power as nuclear weapons states. For countries like, that's important to, I think I always try to emphasize, it's important to remember that for countries like Fiji and Nicaragua and the Seychelles, it's also, you can see the appeal of the NPT because these are countries that are never going to develop a nuclear weapons program. They have no purpose for one, no interest in one. The NPT, what it does is wonderful because it helps to guarantee their safety and security because it means that we're not living in a nuclear arms race and one of their more belligerent neighbors isn't going to, get nuclear weapons. If you're a Caribbean nation, you don't want Mexico with nuclear weapons, for example. So you can see the appeal for that. It's for all the mid-range countries, right, that always had an issue with this. And they did, and they complained about this vigorously in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Countries like India, like Yugoslavia, like Argentina, that, said this is nuclear apartheid. That was the Indian kind of claim on this, right? We are up and coming, powerful countries. What is in this for us? You're telling us to kind of hang back and not become, nuclear weapon states. But we are, significant countries. And Iran was in many ways in that league in the 1970s, and yet it chose in 1968 to sign the NPT. It was one of the original signatories of the NPT the day it opened for signatures in 1968 and immediately, ratified by 1970. The head of Iran's nuclear program at the time, Akbar Etemad, has given some fascinating interviews. He's in his 90s now, he lives in Paris. He's given some fascinating interviews in recent years where he has said, we should never have signed. He said all these other mid-range countries didn't sign. And what they did instead is they went to the threshold, they developed the technology, and then they joined, right? And as you know, it took many, many years, decades to get all of the countries, I think something like 40 or so countries joined in 1968. But it wasn't until about 20 years ago that all countries had finally joined. And in the case of a couple of countries, and when I say all, almost all, in the case of a couple of countries, they simply never joined. And I'm thinking of India and Pakistan, who said, no, we're actually going to go ahead and build nuclear weapons. And there was not much anyone could do to stop that. And then, of course, North Korea that pulled out, decided the NPT wasn't worth its trouble and then pulled out and actually built a bomb. And of course, Israel that has never joined as well and has also built at least 200 nuclear weapons. The thing about that I think is, particularly relevant is that, Iran basically, like a lot of other countries, sort of shot itself in the foot in a sense, because the Shah made a calculation that, with its close U.S. With its kind of close U.S. alliance, that it could benefit from. And there are two ways you could get nuclear cooperation in the 1970s if you're a country like Iran. You can either join the NPT and do it through the kind of, mechanism that's being created and led by the U.S. and so on, if you have close alliances with a powerful country, nuclear weapon armed country, or you can decide to say, no, we're going to go our own way and we're going to go to the threshold and then we're going to join the NPT. And Iran sort of, did it the sort of, I guess, the legalistic way, and that made sense at the time. What no one saw coming was the revolution, and the fact that as soon as the revolution took place, very understandably, and for some very, very good reasons, a lot of the powerful states said, no, we are not going to cooperate with Iran anymore. I don't care if you're in the NPT. We're not going to help you develop peaceful nuclear technology because we don't trust you. But what's relevant about that, it often gets left out of the history, is that Iran, ironically, just as Iran was no longer able to benefit from this cooperation, Iran made its own decision that it didn't want to pursue any kind of nuclear program. I mean, Ayatollah Khomeini famously dismantled the entire program. So it was sinful against Islam. It was one of those shiny Western objects that the Shah had been overly fascinated by, and that Iran didn't want to pursue this. Well, fine, but Iran still had a need for some peaceful nuclear technology, and it found itself cut off at every point along the way. When in the 1980s, for example, the U.S. pressured China and Argentina to stop selling Iran the fuel that it needed. It happened again in the 1990s. And Iran found itself in a difficult position because it genuinely needed the energy and the radioisotopes for its medical treatment and all these kinds of things. And it was a member of the NPT, but every time it tried to develop these things, according to the mechanisms of the NPT, it found that one of the most powerful countries in the world pressured other allies not to cooperate with it in actual violation of the NPT's principle. Right? Now, I'm saying all this and everything else I'm going to say in the little bit of time that I have left. I want to emphasize this is not in any way to sort of no special love for the Islamic Republic or for Iran or to defend. There's a whole hell of a lot of things they do wrong and that are open to condemnation and should be condemned. But on the whole, when you look at the kind of the history of the nuclear program, I don't think, and I think it's fair to say that I don't think that Iran has actually been the obstacle. And here's why. Because beginning in the early 1990s, Iran made the strategic choice that if it was not going to be able to get above board cooperation through the NPT for its nuclear program, it was going to have to find more secretive ways to develop what it was doing. And that began to create this very self-fulfilling kind of cycle, where naturally Israel or the US or a lot of other countries that didn't trust Iran were suddenly saying, wait a minute, what are they doing? Right? What are they doing in secret? And the more that happened, the more Iran felt it had to kind of be secretive. And so it took something that was actually legit and legal under the NPT, and it gave it this air of kind of secretiveness. And that's when we see the crisis beginning. And I know I'm basically out of time, so I would have loved to kind of run through some of the later history as well, because I think that's equally relevant. But just very, very briefly, I'll say, Iran in the early 2000s, when this kind of nuclear crisis began, had only something like 163 centrifuges, first generation kind of old decrepit stuff. And now it's, sort of thousands and thousands of second generation centrifuges. I think this has become a very self-fulfilling crisis. I think this is something that could have been resolved very easily in the first Bush administration when it first came up. But unfortunately, I think the United States took a very hardline approach to this and a kind of zero enrichment attitude. It's important to remember that in 2003, Iran actually did suspend its nuclear program completely, and that 16 US intelligence agencies verified that that did in fact happen. And it only restarted in 2005 when it sensed that the E3 process wasn't really going anywhere. This kind of hardline approach was, that it sort of fell back into a corner. It's a very complicated issue, and as I can see that I'm out of time, but I do think that looking at history is an important starting point. And I think it's too easy to to kind of leave some of these issues out.